already have a good portion of the Apocrypha language in it, and so maybe it's not, we already got the gist of a lot of the stuff that's already there.
Oh yes, but like I mentioned with Tobit, if you want to know about angels and the view of angels in the New Testament period, read Tobit. Tobit's why we look at them that way. So if you wonder why that, remember the girl who opened the door to Peter and thought it was Peter's angel? Do you remember that? Yeah. Why do they have that view? That's from Tobit.
Well, maybe some of those people back then, even the addition of printing costs, thought that we've already got so much of this in the New Testament anyway, it kind of helps justify not reprinting it, just the original text.
Well, mainly it's because it wasn't canonical. You know, most groups, Protestant, well, Catholics view it as canonical. You know, Anglicans view it as partially canonical. You know, that's the point, is it wasn't viewed as canonical. But as I've shown you, as I think you've seen, these are not unimportant documents. You know, that's the point. They are important documents. And like I told you, ladies, I mean, why would you want to leave out some really neat stuff about, you know, well, I mean, you want to show your husband, right, about watch out, right? I mean, we had another one that did that too, but she put a tent peg, that was in Judges. Remember the lady put the tent peg through the head of the fleeing general. I love this stuff. Isn't this good? I mean, it's great stuff. This is not the kind of stories you tell your kids, right, before bedtime. No. There are 101 allusions in the New Testament documents from Ecclesiastes. Baruch. The material is presented as if written by Baruch, the disciple of Jeremiah. You know, remember that he's mentioned in the Old Testament. During the time of the Babylonian exile, about 600 BC, it's dated, we think that the writing was around 200 to 150 BC due to the dependence on later writings. That's one of the ways we tell the time of writings. It could have been written originally in Hebrew, but we have no manuscripts or fragments. It's a composite book of 5 chapters as a compilation of prayers and hymns. And Baruch was used a lot in the early church. Remember, if you compare Baruch to a lot of liturgies, Catholic, Anglican, Lutheran liturgies, you want to find some pieces of Baruch here, there, and everywhere. As a matter of fact, some pieces of Baruch you might find in some Jewish liturgy also. It provides a glimpse of activity in the synagogues outside Palestine in this period. That's why it's so important. One of the important parts from the New Testament is, where did all the New Testament Christians go to church initially? In the synagogues, right? So, you know, we don't have a lot of understanding or knowledge of what happened in synagogues during this period. Guess what? In Baruch, you do. That's what's so neat about this document. It includes exhortation against association with idolatry, a celebration of the law as God's wisdom, and encouragements and promises to faithful Jews. Used by the early church a lot, shows how close the early church was to synagogue worship, doesn't it? Isn't that neat? Because if you're using synagogue worship documents in your worship, hey, you're pretty close. You're very close. Indicates the early church thought of themselves as Jews. The reasons the rabbis would not like Baruch: number 1, synagogue worship outside of Israel proper. Number 2, likely Greek. There's medium Hellenization in the document, some signs of Hellenization. One of the reasons it was so powerful to Christians in the period. Issues: it is attributed to Baruch, but too late to be that document, and it's a Dirash view. But you knew that. Almost all these apocryphal documents are Dirash views. That's the way it is. Here's the allusions, and there are how many? 6. 6 allusions to Baruch in the New Testament documents. The Epistle of Jeremiah is a sermon of homily and a tract against pagan idolatry. Makes much use. It's great. Okay, typically Hebraic writings is full of dark humor. Hebraic writings has great dark humor, but usually it doesn't have sarcasm and ridicule. Usually not. Sarcasm and ridicule, you know, usually if you remember the Ruth class, Naomi did not use ridicule. She didn't use a whole lot of sarcasm. She just went right to the throat. She was pretty nasty. So usually what you find in Hebraic literature is very straightforward, sometimes understated, but dark. Generally this uses ridicule and sarcasm, and ridicule and sarcasm are very common in Greek literature. So, purports to be a copy of the letter written by Jeremiah and dated in 317 BC. That's an early date, but some scholars place it as late as 165 BC. That's a late date. It's often printed as a 6-chapter group. It's set as a letter written to the Jews in exile in Babylon. There's a verse 72 problem that indicates it could have been written originally in Hebrew, but we don't have any manuscripts or fragments. The only originals and among the Dead Sea Scrolls are Greek fragments. And like I said, there's a high degree of ridicule. Whenever you see ridicule and sarcasm in a document, it's likely Greek in this period. That's just the way Greeks like to write, you know. By the way, there's a high degree of ridicule and sarcasm in the New Testament. Anybody ever read the Sermon on the Mount? If your right eye offends you, what should you do? Rip it out, right? If your right arm offends you, you should rip it off, right? That is typical Greek writing. Very typical. Let's see. There's only one from the Epistle of Jeremiah. The Psalms of the Holy Three Children, including the prayer of Azariah. It's an embellishment. Well, this is what they say. Okay, this is what many people think. This is not necessarily what I think, but that's okay. It's thought to be an embellishment of the ordeal of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego recorded in the canonical book of Daniel, designed to be added after verse 23 of the 3rd chapter. It consists of prayers and hymns of the sort which might have been offered to God by the three while in the furnace. Remember what I told you about Old Testament prayer? You know, there's not a lot of prayer that's individual prayer in the Old Testament, right? Daniel, you would not expect to see. Now, Daniel does pray privately, right? Privately. But his prayers are very Old Testament. These are very New Testament-like prayers. Kind of neat. There are puns in the Greek. They didn't create the original was Greek. You know, there's not a lot of sarcasm, ridicule, so you don't notice that. There is some Hellenization in it. This prayer and hymn were used extensively in the churches and in later centuries. So you might find it in your liturgy. You might even find some psalms or hymns that are written with this in it, with these pieces in it. The reasons the rabbis wouldn't like them, because it's Greek. It's outside Judea and Babylon. It was used extensively in the early church. You know those guys. Issues adds back the prayer that was acceptable during the Apocryphal time, but not during the Old Testament. So in other words, this is a New Testament style, Apocryphal style of prayer, not Old Testament style of prayer. There are Talmudic details in it that are not in the Old Testament. So it's later Jewish writing and thought, and likely it is an addition. But it's useful. Like any of the prayers are useful, right? If you're Anglican, what do you got? You got a prayer book. If you're Lutheran, what do you got? A prayer book. You might not call it that, but that's what you got. If you're Catholic, you might have a prayer book. You know what I'm saying? So, since winter prayer is not useful. May not be in a fiery furnace, but it might feel that way sometimes. So, Susanna. Now we're getting into the Daniel ones. I got just a short period of time to give you the Daniel ones. Susanna is a short story about two lecherous men, judges, older guys, who tried to tried to force her to have sex with him. They saw her bathing in her private garden, snuck in, and then colluded against her. Because remember, in Jewish thought, if you have 2 or 3 witnesses, then you can condemn. So they condemned her for adultery, for trying to seduce them. And Daniel comes up and basically tricks the men into exposing the fact that they did wrong. Because he uses basic detective methods, you know, to question them. So it's like a detective novel. It's probably one of the earliest detective novels we know. It's probably written originally in Greek, because there's a couple of puns in Greek. It was originally in the Septuagint version of Daniel, between chapters 12 and 14. In between that area. Susanna means lily in Greek, and the reasons rabbis wouldn't like it, because it's Greek, because it's outside Judea, because it's about a virtuous woman. You notice there's a theme here about throwing stuff out. The 2 elders are bad guys. It makes light of the Jewish judicial system. And the young man Daniel, who was a eunuch, by the way. You knew that, right? Daniel was a eunuch. Yeah, very clear in the Old Testament. Wins against 2 elder Jews of Babylon. There's no historical issues. This is what I'm questioning. There's no historical issues, but there are Talmudic details that bring into question the issues between rabbinic schools. This is obviously a fight between some rabbinic schools. I don't have time to get into details, but there were fights always between the 4 rabbinic schools that we know of. The Alexandrian, the Greek, or the Alexandrian, the Babylonian, the Jerusalem, and the Galil, school of Galil. So they were always in conflict, and this indicates one of their conflicts. Let's see, there is only one in Acts and Matthew to Suzanne. Bel and the Dragon. Bel and the Dragon is a combination of 2 stories which were also attached to Daniel in the Septuagint at the end of the book. The story of Bel concerns a Babylonian idol by that name, to which Daniel refused to give an offering. He was challenged and told the Persian king that the vain idol had no need for offerings, because what would happen is the priests would put the food before Bel and close up the temple, and then in the morning when they opened it up, the food was gone.
They eat the food.
Yeah, the priests were eating the food. And the way he figured it out is he put down ashes, spread ashes on the temple floor, and found out there was a secret entrance to the temple that the priests were using. And of course, the priests got croaked because they were bad. So that's Bel and the Dragon. And, you know, in the story of the dragon, Daniel refuses to worship the actual living dragon. There's a dragon that the king keeps in Babylon, and they worship it. And so he accepts the challenge to slay it without a sword or staff. He feeds the dragon a concoction of pitch, fat, and hair, which causes it to burst open and die. Gives it a rat poisoning. Daniel's enemies then cause him to be thrown into the lion's den again in the dragon. But the hungry lions are fed with abundant food brought from Israel by the prophet Habakkuk, who's transported to Babylon with food by angels. So this was likely written in the Maccabean period, possibly giving reassurance to the Jews during the struggle against the Seleucid Empire. Did you ever wonder where the ideas of dragons came from? Guess where? This book. You used to have it in Daniel, but they took it away from you. The reasons rabbis wouldn't like it, it's Greek outside Judea, exposing the bad priests. That's pretty close to home, right? Spiritual thematic elements, you know, Habakkuk, etc. They didn't like that. And also the angels. Remember the angels part? I told you that was added in the Apocryphal period. The issues, there are thematic elements that are not supported by either Old Testament documents, by other Old Testament documents. Habakkuk being, you know, carried. You know, you think he would have mentioned that, right? Because he wrote a book. So you think he would have mentioned visiting Daniel in Babylon. There's no historical problems otherwise, other than that. There is only one allusion to Bel and the Dragon. The song, prayer of Manasseh. Manasseh, a song of repentance composed to suit the situation. Manasseh, the king of Judea, Judah, who was carried to captive to Babylon. Manasseh was a bad king, right? And what he, according to this psalm, he basically, you know, prays his repentance to God in this psalm. It's a really neat psalm. It's mentioned in 2 Chronicles, this prayer. So it's a huge question, is it real or not? We only have Greek versions. It was rejected by the Roman Catholics at the Council of Trent. The first council where they defined a canon, but it was used extensively in the early church. And like I said, I mean, went throughout a prayer. The reasons they wouldn't like it, it's Greek, it's used extensively in the early church, it's positive about a bad king. That's always bad for some people. There are no other issues, other than it's not likely a historical source. So anyway, you know, that's about it for these documents. I mean, I know this is a whirlwind tour. I wanted to split this into 2 so we'd have more time to basically look at some of these documents. But, you know, for a whirlwind tour, I mean, this is, you get some good ideas about them. You get to see the historical veracity of them. You get to see, you know, about the documents a little bit. And doesn't it make you want to read these, you know, especially the Daniel ones? The Daniel ones are really, they're very short. They're like 1 chapter, kind of size. Really neat. Judith is